Hey there. Tonight, I want you to imagine something: no heating, no electricity, no double-paned windows, and definitely no cozy flannel pajamas. Just a brittle wind whispering through the cracks in your mud-plastered walls, and the kind of cold that doesn't politely nip at your nose. It moves in, sets up shop in your bones, and starts charging rent in your lungs. Welcome to a medieval winter. No, not the festive part with snow-covered castles and jolly minstrels. I'm talking about the real, raw, frost-bitten struggle of surviving December through March when your roof leaks, your fire's on life support, and your best source of warmth might just be a goat with boundary issues. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. No pity clicks here. And subscribe for more if history that hurts a little is your thing. Drop a comment below letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating how far these little stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe throw a blanket over your legs, and if you're feeling fancy, light a candle, because we're about to go back to a time when winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was a test of endurance, stubbornness, and whether or not your house would fall apart before your spirit did. Winter wasn't just an annual inconvenience for medieval peasants. It was a full-on siege, an icy, merciless campaign that showed up every year uninvited and refused to leave until it had humbled everyone, stolen a few lives, and turned even the toughest villagers into sniffling, frost-bitten shadows of themselves. You didn't just wake up and say, "Ooh, chilly morning." You woke up, if you were lucky, and thought, "Hey, my breath didn't freeze inside my throat." Progress. Medieval houses, if we're being generous, were more suggestions of shelter than actual protection. The construction technique most peasants relied on was called wattle and daub, which sounds adorable until you realize it involved weaving sticks together and slathering them in mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. Imagine living inside a soggy wicker basket glued together with yesterday's cow pie. It got better. Floors, dirt, literal dirt, which meant the cold didn't just creep in from the windows, it rose from beneath you like some haunted frost spirit. Add in a thatched roof that doubled as a sponge for every snowflake, and a wind that practically had keys to your house, and you begin to understand why people didn't survive winter. They endured it. The best insult? The fire. Oh yes, the fire was your precious baby. You built it, fed it, cooed at it, maybe whispered a few curses in its direction when it sputtered out. But no matter how much you loved that fire, it only warmed a 2-foot radius. If you sat right next to it, congratulations, you had toasty toes. Move an inch to the left, and suddenly you were a human popsicle with trust issues. And because these homes were built by people whose idea of insulation was shove some moss in the cracks and pray, the cold didn't just sneak in, it moved in. It filled every corner, clung to your clothes, licked at your skin while you slept, and smirked at your suffering like some smug winter gremlin. But peasants didn't just sit around moaning. Well, okay, maybe a little moaning. But they adapted. They stuffed the walls with straw, they patched the roof with whatever wasn't already on fire, they layered so many tunics they looked like medieval onions with commitment issues, and they huddled together like meatballs in a very sad, very itchy human spaghetti. Because here's the deal. Winter didn't care if you were tired or hungry, or if you'd already buried 2 goats and an uncle. It came anyway. And you either fought back with everything you had, mud, moss, sheep grease, or you froze. And this was just the beginning. If medieval peasant homes had a heartbeat in winter, it was the fire. Not a grand roaring fireplace with decorative stone and a bearskin rug, no. We're talking about a smoky, sputtering pile of burning sticks in the center of the room, usually surrounded by coughing children, half-scorched soup pots, and at least one chicken who couldn't mind her own business. There wasn't a chimney. That luxury was reserved for people with things like walls that didn't leak and roofs that didn't host rodents. In peasant homes, the smoke just sort of lingered. It swirled through the air like it was trying to make conversation. You breathed it in, your eyes burned, your lungs got a little more seasoned, and somehow everyone just called that Tuesday. The fire was your oven, your heater, your light source, and your pest control. Nothing keeps fleas, lice, and whatever that thing in the straw pile was at bay like 24/7 passive fumigation. If you were lucky, you only coughed up half a lung before breakfast. If not, well, it was a great day to practice shallow breathing. But here's the thing about these fires. They were needy. You couldn't just light it and walk away like some medieval arsonist. You had to tend it, stoke it, feed it. It needed attention, constant attention. It was the emotional toddler of your household, but instead of throwing tantrums, it punished you with frostbite, and, God help you, if it went out during the night. Starting a new fire wasn't like striking a match. It was flint, steel, dried grass, desperation, and roughly the same number of prayers as a papal coronation. That's why people learned to bank the fire, an ancient technique that involved burying the glowing embers under a mound of ash before bed, like tucking in a very dangerous, very temperamental pet rock. If you did it right, the embers would still be alive in the morning, warm and glowing, just waiting to be poked back to life. If you did it wrong, well, congrats. You just turned your house into a very cold, very sad tomb. Have fun freezing while you weep into your last turnip. Some families took turns watching the fire overnight. Little ones, old ones, anyone who could sit upright without falling. Into the hearth became part of Ember Patrol, because there was no greater shame in the house than being that person, the one who let the fire die, the one who woke everyone up to a frigid room and no way to fix it except for flint, failure, and frostbite. Yet, despite all the coughing, the eye-watering smoke, and the nightly panic, the fire was hope. That flickering light in the dark. That line between warmth and a slow creeping end. Without it, you weren't just cold. You were done. And so, they guarded it. They hovered near it. They shaped their entire lives around its tiny, stubborn glow, because in a world made of cold stone, and colder nights, the fire wasn't just survival, it was sacred. Let's talk about sleep. That magical thing you're supposed to get 8 hours of, preferably under a cozy duvet, surrounded by silence and essential oil diffusers. Now forget all of that. Because for medieval peasants, sleep wasn't rest. It was warfare. A nightly campaign to stay alive, wrapped in rags, huddled like sardines, and trying not to wake up as a historical ice sculpture. First of all, beds? That word did a lot of heavy lifting. If you had a bed, it was usually a rough wooden frame stuffed with straw, hay, or whatever dead plant material you could scavenge without upsetting your neighbor. And if you didn't have a frame, which, spoiler, you probably didn't, you just threw that straw right on the dirt floor like a hopeful woodland creature and called it a night. Luxury? Not exactly. The straw flattened quickly, turned moldy, faster, and made for a fine nesting ground for fleas, lice, beetles, and what some historians have politely referred to as other. Tossing and turning wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a careful dance to avoid poking yourself on something crunchy, itchy, or slightly moving. But straw wasn't just for comfort, it was insulation. A fragile plant-based barrier between your body and the frozen earth, which, by the way, had zero interest in your well-being. Every part of your house tried to kill you but the floor. That was the silent assassin. Cold radiated up from the ground like an angry ghost. If you dropped something in the middle of the night, it didn't just hit the floor, it joined the permafrost. So people got creative. They layered straw on top of dried rushes. They added herbs like lavender or rosemary to cut the smell of goat, mud, and human despair. They never removed the old layers, just tossed new ones on top. Over time, this formed what can only be described as an evolving biohazard ecosystem under your bed, complete with the comforting aroma of decomposition And, speaking of comfort, privacy was a myth. Entire households slept together, and I don't mean in a cozy, snuggles way. I mean in a desperate human lasagna stacked on hay kind of way. Parents, kids, grandparents, random cousins, and occasionally a goat. Everyone layered in like a living casserole, just trying to trap whatever meager body heat they could before the night claimed another toe. The hierarchy was simple. Babies and the elderly went in the middle, warmest, safest, most likely to survive the night. Everyone else formed the crust, sacrificial heat shields. If you were on the edge, congratulations. You got all the cold and none of the cuddles. If you sneezed, coughed, or rolled over in your sleep, you risked shoving poor Aunt Edith into a draft so sharp it could etch glass. Welcome to the Guilt Olympics. There were rules, unspoken but deadly serious. Don't hog the cloak, don't fart into the straw. It lingers. Don't elbow the person keeping the fire alive, and for the love of all that's holy, don't invite another animal onto the pile unless it generates heat and doesn't poop where it sleeps. Because yes, animals slept inside too, not in a separate barn, not even in a corner penned off for hygiene. Right there, in the room, beside you, possibly on top of you. Cows pressed against the wall like furry radiators. Chickens roosted in the rafters. Pigs grunted softly at your feet. Goats? Well, goats did whatever the hell they wanted, and you just accepted it. Why? Because every warm body mattered. Animals were space heaters that mooed, oinked, and occasionally bit. But they were warm. And in the middle of a freezing night, with the wind crying through the cracks, a snoring pig was preferable to a silent death, and so you slept, if you could call it that, amid the smell of hay, smoke, damp wool, and barnyard funk, listening to the soft crackle of the hearth, your cousin's wheeze, and the deeply unsettling sound of a chicken laying an egg somewhere above your head. Sleep wasn't restful. It was a fragile truce with the cold, and every morning you woke up still breathing was a quiet triumph. You scratched your bites, counted your fingers, and prepared to do it all again, because in the medieval world, waking up wasn't guaranteed. It was earned. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how utterly unprepared a medieval peasant's house was for actual weather. Not just the chill, but the relentless, creeping, soul-chewing winter. Because when you live in a structure made of sticks, mud, and raw optimism, a snowstorm isn't just a weather event. It's an existential crisis with frostbite. Picture it, a tiny hut slapped together with wattle and daub. A medieval building technique that's about as sturdy as it sounds. You start with a bunch of wooden poles jammed into the ground like skeletal ribs, then weave thinner branches between them like you're making a very sad basket. Then you smear this entire frame with a generous paste of mud, straw, and animal dung, because nothing says home sweet home like walls that smell faintly of barnyard and desperation. This charming blend hardened into a crusty, cracking skin that barely kept the wind out and definitely didn't impress passing wolves. Over time, the mud flaked off, the straw rotted, and you were left with something that looked like a termite's fever dream. And yet somehow it was still considered an upgrade from a cave. Insulation! That was a fantasy. The wind had full access. It waltzed through gaps in the wall like it paid rent. You could patch holes with moss, cloth, or your last remaining shred of dignity, but the cold always found its way back in. There was no draft. It was a constant swirling blizzard inside your house, like living inside a giant's wheezing lungs. The roofs? Oh, dear sweet medieval rooftops, usually made of thatch, which is a polite word for a messy pile of reeds stacked on top of your walls and held down by hope, string, and maybe a rock or two. In the summer, they were dry and flammable. In the winter, they soaked up water like a cursed sponge and sagged lower with every snowfall until you had to duck to avoid becoming part of the ceiling. Roofs leaked constantly. That pleasant plinking sound you heard at night, not rain on your window. There were no windows. That was the roof slowly dripping its disappointment, onto your sleeping face. And if the thatch wasn't packed just right, it welcomed guests, birds, mice, bugs, and on one memorable occasion, a drunk ferret, all moved in like they'd found an Airbnb with no cancellation policy. Windows, if they existed at all, were miniature holes covered with oiled parchment or stretched animal skin. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of cloudy plastic wrap, only colder, smellier, and far less transparent. Glass? That was for lords, churches, and people who didn't eat turnip soup 6 nights a week. Most peasants just hoped the cowhide nailed over the window didn't blow off during a snowstorm. Spoiler, it did. Doors were wooden planks, if you were lucky, tied shut with rope or pinned in place with a stick. They didn't lock. They barely closed. You could throw a tantrum in, a strong wind, and knock one off its hinges, which meant the cold didn't knock. It just walked in, made itself comfortable, and helped itself to your soup. The floors? Compacted dirt. And by compacted, I mean occasionally stomped flat by muddy feet, hooves, and possibly a wagon wheel. When it rained, the floor turned into a marsh. When it snowed, it froze solid. If you stepped on it barefoot at night, you didn't just wince, you reevaluated your life choices, and in spring, when all the snow melted into your floor like some cruel joke, it became what peasants half-jokingly referred to as indoor plumbing. There was no drainage, just puddles, sludge, and the occasional very confused chicken floating. To combat this horror, people got creative. They jammed moss into the walls, daubed more mud over cracks, and stuffed straw into roof holes like they were building a particularly miserable scarecrow. Some families even mixed fresh dung with straw and slapped it directly onto the outside of the house as a winter ritual. And you know what? It worked. Kind of. At least until it froze, cracked, or got eaten by some determined insect. Still, peasants didn't sit around crying into their goat-scented cloaks. Okay, maybe a little crying, but mostly they patched, stuffed, prayed, and tried not to scream when the wind found that one new hole in the wall you just fixed yesterday. Because when your house was one stiff gust away from becoming kindling, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about outlasting the weather, one muddy, sagging, manure-insulated wall at a time. By now, you've probably figured out that sleeping through a medieval winter wasn't exactly like curling up under a weighted blanket with chamomile tea and a podcast. No, it was an act of stubborn defiance, a nightly survival drill. And sometimes, just sometimes, the only way to make it through was to not even try sleeping all at once. Enter the strategy that kept countless peasants breathing through the darkest, draftiest hours of the night. Sleeping in shifts, this wasn't a choice. It wasn't about catching up on journaling, late-night chores, or meaningful one-on-one goat time. It was cold, ruthless, practical. The fire had to be watched. The wind had to be monitored. And someone needed to listen for that ominous creak in the roof that meant snow had finally decided gravity was its love language. Most medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of letting the fire burn low. If the flames died, so did your chance of not waking up as a meat popsicle. Restarting a fire in the middle of the night was a medieval nightmare. You needed flint, steel, tinder, dry kindling, which was about as common as polite gossip, and a healthy dose of luck. So instead of risking that, families implemented what can only be described as a grudging rotation of groggy human responsibility. Half the house slept. The other half stayed up watching the fire, patching new cold leaks with old rags, and occasionally muttering bitter insults at the wind like it owed them money. You didn't get to volunteer. You got nudged, elbowed, or gently kicked awake when it was your turn. If you were a child who could hold a stick without lighting the house on fire, congratulations, you were promoted to Ember Guardian. If you were a grandparent with arthritis so bad that standing up took 45 minutes and a motivational speech, you still pulled duty, sitting next to the fire with a heavy blanket and a firm glare, ready to defend the last spark with your remaining teeth if necessary. The night dragged, the wind whistled, the coals hissed and threatened to fade, and you? You shuffled over half asleep, eyes burning from smoke, kneeling on a dirt floor that had all the warmth of a tomb. You prodded the embers, fed in a piece of wood so small it might as well have been a suggestion, and tried not to curse loud enough to wake the baby or startle the pig. Every now and then, someone would nod off at their post. It happened. You'd snap awake with the realization that the fire was dimming. The cold had crept in, and your entire family was about to start a very cranky morning. That's how you earned the shame glare at breakfast, the unspoken "you had one job" look, that somehow carried more weight than a sermon. Sometimes even animals joined the night watch unintentionally. A cow, restless from the cold, might stomp near the fire and accidentally shift a log. A goat might chew on your shirt or nibble your hair as a midnight snack. Chickens, roosting overhead in the beams, would occasionally contribute by pooping directly onto the fire, releasing a stench so powerful it doubled as natural tear gas. Despite the chaos, the system worked. The embers lived. The hearth, smoky and sulky, remained the flickering heart of the home. You'd pass the torch, literally and metaphorically, to the next unlucky soul, drag your stiff limbs back to the communal hay pile, and try to fall asleep, beside your cousin's snoring nose and your grandmother's bony elbow. If you were lucky, you'd squeeze in 3 hours of half-conscious, flea-bitten slumber before being elbowed again. Why go through all this? Because dying in your sleep wasn't some poetic metaphor. It was the literal risk of a failed rotation. If nobody watched the fire, the cold would come in, and the cold, as medieval peasants knew all too well, had no mercy and no bedtime, so they took turns. They sacrificed comfort for heat, sleep for smoke, and silence for the persistent crackle of a flame that meant life. And through that grim, smoky dance of shifting sleepers, they made it to morning, one bleary-eyed guardian at a time. Modern winter comfort is a thick slice of lasagna, a hot mug of cocoa, and maybe a cinnamon candle, burning nearby while snow politely taps at the window. But for medieval peasants, winter food wasn't about comfort. It was strategy. Because when the cold was biting your face and whispering in your ears that maybe today was the day it took your fingers, the only warmth you could count on was what came from inside your body, your guts, your digestion, your stomach working. Over time, like a furnace fueled by roots, grains, and blind hope. In other words, food was heat, real heat. The more you ate, the harder your body had to work, and the more it warmed itself up. Calories meant survival, which brings us to the sacred winter motto of peasants everywhere: stuff yourself or freeze trying. But before you picture a hearty meal with roast chickens and buttered rolls, let's talk reality. There were no pantries, no supermarkets, no midnight snack runs. What you had in winter was what you had preserved from the harvest months, which meant salted meat, dried peas, old onions, root vegetables you prayed hadn't rotted, and bread so dense you could patch a wall with it. Turnips were the main event. Turnips, parsnips, and the ever-suffering cabbage. These were boiled into thick, colorless stews that smelled like sadness and survival. If you were lucky, there might be a leftover scrap of bacon or a bone tossed in for flavor. If you weren't, well, there was salt. Hopefully, grains were gold. Porridge made from barley or oats became the go-to belly stuffer. It didn't taste like much, but it sat in your stomach like a hot rock. That was the goal. You wanted something heavy, slow to digest, and slightly regrettable. A medieval heat pack with side effects and fat, glorious, life-saving fat, was prized above all. If you had lard, you used it. If you had a sausage, you rationed it like treasure. Fat burned slower than lean meat, meaning it kept you warmer. Longer? Eating a fat-soaked chunk of bread might make your arteries cry, but your frozen toes whispered their thanks. For peasants, food wasn't about taste. It was about staying alive one belly-churning meal at a time. If you went to bed with a full stomach, you had a better shot at waking up with all your extremities attached. If you went to bed hungry, you might not wake up at all. That's why winter evenings often turned into family feeding frenzies. Parents forced food into picky children with the kind of stern urgency usually reserved for fire drills. You don't like boiled turnip stew? Too bad, Thomas. You'll like frostbite even less. Harsh? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. Sometimes they even ate right before bed, loading up on the most digestible calories they could scrape together. Bread soaked in broth, porridge laced with old butter. If someone had a bit of salted pork left from Christmas, that was a feast worthy of song. And you bet they sang. Mostly to distract themselves from the smell, but food wasn't just fuel, it was hope. That steaming pot in the center of the room wasn't just dinner, it was a message. We made it another day. The smells, even when questionable, meant life. They meant warmth. They meant one more step through the season that tried to kill you every morning. Sure, it gave you dreams, strange, vivid dreams. The kind where you're being chased through a cabbage field by your landlord while wearing nothing but turnips. But that was a small price to pay for warmth that came from the inside out. And when you crawled into your straw-filled bed, bloated, burping, and a little sweaty from the effort of digestion, you didn't complain. You were winning. You were warm, even if the stew was mostly water, and the bread was hard enough to chip a tooth. It was heat. It was fuel. It was survival. And in the war against winter, your belly was the last battleground, and your weapon of choice was the humble, heroic, slightly moldy root vegetable. When the wind was screaming through the walls, the fire was wheezing, its last breath, and your cloak was about as useful as a soggy napkin. You got resourceful. Because medieval peasants didn't just endure the cold. They hacked it, bodged it, outwitted it, using whatever they could find that wasn't already frozen to the floor. Let's start with what may be the most underrated piece of medieval technology, the heated stone, not some fancy hearth warmed slab with a copper handle, just a rock. A big, flat, heavy rock that you could toss directly into the center of the fire like you were making pagan stew. Once it was blazing hot but not yet lava, someone, usually the youngest child because siblings are cruel, would drag it out with a stick, wrap it in rags, shove it in a clay pot or leather pouch, and jam it under the hay in their bed. Et voila, medieval hot water bottle. Burn risk, moderate to severe. Comfort level, better than frostbite. If you did it right, the stone would radiate heat for hours, slowly warming the straw under your legs while you pretended not to notice the smoke rising from your cousin's blanket. And if you did it wrong, well, nothing wakes a family up faster than a flaming mattress made of hay, mold, and dry goat hair. Sleep tight. But heated rocks were just the beginning. Some peasants, perhaps those with a little more hay and a lot more audacity, created something called a hay box. Now don't get excited, it's not glamorous, but it was brilliant. A hay box was basically a big wooden crate stuffed with dry hay. Sounds cozy already, right? You'd cook a pot of stew until it was bubbling hot, then remove it from the fire early, nestle it into the hay box, cover it in, more hay, and leave it alone. The residual heat trapped in that little cocoon would keep cooking the food for hours, slowly, gently, and without using any more precious firewood. Basically, it was the world's first slow cooker, minus the electricity, and sanitation, and plus a few hay fibers in your turnip broth. But wait, there's more. Sometimes peasants used bricks, tiles, or even metal tools for heat storage. Anything that could survive a visit to the fire and not shatter in half was fair game. These were tucked under beds, behind cloaks, or under makeshift benches. You'd heat your rock, brick, or cast iron ladle, carry it like a relic, and use it to warm your boots, your bedding, or your frozen thighs. The goal was efficiency. If you were going to burn a log, that log better serve dinner, warm your seat, and give you second-degree burns in the shape of your favorite skillet. Nothing was wasted. Heat was precious, and whatever could hold it held it. Clothing was hacked, too. Peasants lined their cloaks with sheepskin, rabbit fur, or if you were particularly broke and brave, chicken feathers. They greased their boots with animal fat. They rubbed wax on wool to repel water. One legend even claims that villagers would sleep with heated loaves of bread under their cloaks to warm their chests. Eat it in the morning, regret nothing. And, of course, walls and windows weren't safe from innovation either. Moss was jammed into every gap. Old rags were soaked in fat and tacked over holes. Sometimes people coated entire walls in a second layer of mud and manure, forming what could generously be described as a thermal paste, or, more honestly, as poop plaster. It didn't smell good, but it worked, at least until it thawed and started. Sliding down the wall like a sad brown avalanche, every single thing a medieval peasant did in winter was a gamble. Warmth versus fire, smoke versus breath, insulation versus insects, comfort versus not dying. And every night, as the wind howled through, the trees and the stars blinked coldly overhead. They curled up in their crunchy straw nests, surrounded by steaming rocks and boiling hay crates, and thanked the gods of warmth for one more day not frozen stiff. Were the methods weird? Yes. Were they effective? Also, yes. Were they occasionally flammable? You bet. But they survived. One burnt finger and bread brick pillow at a time. By the time January rolled around, the cold had stopped being a weather condition and become a permanent resident of the house. It was in the floor, in your bones, in your thoughts. And if the fire didn't get you warm, something else did. Anger, desperation, madness. Because here's what no one tells you about surviving a medieval winter. It's not just physical, it's personal. You're crammed into a mud-walled hut, no bigger than a modern kitchen with 7 to 12 other people, half of whom snore like farm equipment, and the other half haven't bathed since the harvest. The air is thick with smoke, turnip farts, damp wool, and the sound of someone scratching themselves with what might be a spoon. There is no privacy, no quiet, no escape, just a stew of human frustration simmering on the same fire you're using to not die. The emotional temperature of the room, just as unstable as the roof. Fights didn't just happen. They boiled over food, over firewood, over who let the goat pee in the corner again. There were arguments about who ate too much soup, who used the dry kindling when it wasn't their turn, and who was hogging the warm rock like it was the last bottle of wine during a siege. Even families that normally got along began to crack. Patience wore thin. Voices rose. People stomped out of rooms dramatically, only to remember there wasn't another room to stomp into, so they just stood in the corner, seething beside a cow. And the children, oh, the children. Bored, stir-crazy, filthy children trying to play in a room where one wrong step lands you in a pot of bean water or triggers a miniature landslide of stored onions. With no sunlight, no fresh air, and no space, they became tiny tornadoes of chaos, screaming, fighting, drawing rude pictures in the frost on the wall. The elderly got grumpier. The babies cried louder. The teenagers sighed so hard the fire flickered. Every moment was loud, damp, tense, and itchy. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, someone got sick. Because sickness didn't take winters off. No, it thrived in the filth, the closeness, the stagnant air. A cough from the corner could be a cold or pneumonia, or the early warning sign that you were about to bury your third relative under snow. So thick you'd forget where they were by spring, and still no one could leave. Not for long, not far. The roads were ice, the fields were frozen, and the outside world was just one giant death trap with better lighting. So people leaned on each other, awkwardly, angrily, imperfectly. They argued, yes, but they also sang, told stories, played bone dice, recited prayers until they blurred into song, passed around the same joke for the 50th time because it was all they had. In the darkest weeks of winter, the hut became a boiling kettle of human emotion. Love, hate, irritation, forgiveness, and that one cousin who always stole your seat by the fire. But somehow they endured it, together, because isolation in winter was death, and rage, oddly enough, was still better than silence. Peasants knew this instinctively, that the cold was a beast, and the only way to survive its gnawing teeth was not just with heat, but with noise, with company, with the chaotic, often maddening presence of other warm, breathing humans who were just as tired and frozen and itchy as you. No one got through winter alone. You needed the body next to you, even if they were snoring, even if they ate the last crust of bread, even if they smelled like cabbage and goat milk and passive aggression. You needed them because the cold wasn't just in the air. It was in the silence, in the stillness, in the absence of voices, and that was the kind of cold you didn't always wake up from. There came a moment, always, when someone had to open the door, when the firewood stack got low, when the last turnip had been sliced into mush, when the goat looked at you with that familiar face that meant, "I've been eating roof thatch for 2 days, and I will not be milked until you feed me." And that meant someone had to go outside. Now understand. This wasn't a quick jog to the store. There were no shoes with arch support, no puffer jackets, no Gore-Tex Toyana. There was a cloak made of wool, sometimes leather, and occasionally rabbit, skin stitched together with regret. Your boots were made of hide, stuffed with straw, and about as waterproof as a sponge with ambition. And when the cold hit you, really hit you, it wasn't just a shiver. It was a slap, an insult, a full-body interrogation by nature itself. Your breath turned to smoke, your fingers stiffened, and if there was wind, that wasn't just air. That was an executioner with icy claws, prying into every opening in your clothes like it was looking for your soul. Let's talk firewood. It didn't magically appear by the hearth in neat little piles like some medieval IKEA delivery. You chopped it, hauled it, dragged it in on a sled that was either made from a broken barrel or someone's childhood dreams, and wood wasn't. Infinite. By midwinter, you'd already burned half the fence, the stool nobody liked, and maybe a piece of the barn door if you were feeling rebellious. If you had a forest nearby, you went into it cautiously. Because snow wasn't soft and fluffy, it was deceptive. It covered pits, concealed frozen creeks, hid wolf tracks, and wolves. They weren't fairy tale villains. They were hungry, organized, and not at all concerned about your status as a hard-working serf. Every trip outside meant risk. You could slip, freeze, get lost in a blizzard so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. People tied ropes from their door to the woodshed just to find their way back during storms. Imagine that, tying a lifeline to the outhouse because one wrong step meant wandering into whiteness until you were a peasant-shaped snowdrift. And yet they went. Every day. Someone trudged out to collect eggs from shivering chickens, to chop ice from the well so you didn't die of thirst, to check on the animals who huddled in the barn chewing straw and silently judging your clothing choices. The barn, by the way, wasn't much warmer. It had walls, yes. A roof, probably. But insulation? Not unless you count the smell of manure, which admittedly did have a certain thermal quality when inhaled deeply enough. Still, the animals had to live. You needed their milk, their meat, their warmth. So you shoveled frozen dung, checked for frostbite on hooves, and sometimes, God help you, helped deliver a calf with fingers that barely moved anymore. Because winter didn't care if your knuckles cracked. It didn't care if your joints ached, or your breath came in wheezes. It just kept pushing, so you pushed back. With every frozen bucket hauled from the well, with every log split, every goat fed, every step into the blinding white that threatened to erase you, and when you came back inside, face numb, limbs heavy, half blind from the snow glare, the heat of the fire, weak and wheezing though it was, felt like heaven itself. Not because it was warm, but because it meant you made it again. It didn't end with a grand trumpet. No warm sunrise, no choir of angels. Winter left the way it came, slowly, cruelly, and without apology. One morning, the frost didn't creep quite so far across the floor. The wind didn't shriek through the cracks like it was trying to peel your skin off. Somewhere in the distance, a bird dared to sing a single note, and then went silent. As if remembering where it was, the thaw began not as a celebration, but a challenge. Snow didn't melt, it collapsed, heavy and wet, turning the ground into an ankle-deep stew of ice, mud, and horse manure. Roofs groaned under the weight of soggy thatch. Paths became rivers, and everything that had died in the cold, it surfaced. Quietly, sometimes literally, bodies were found. Animals that hadn't made it, neighbors who hadn't returned from errands, or just small things curled in corners too fragile for one more night. The end of winter brought relief. Yes, but also reckoning. The count began. Who was missing? What was lost? Which parts of the house needed rebuilding, and which parts of your soul? But here's the miracle. You were still here. Bent, scratched, half frozen inside, maybe down a few chickens and up a few emotional scars, but alive. And that meant something. Food was still scarce. The pantry was just a shelf of regret. You'd scraped the last of the salted pork weeks ago. The grain sack had been empty since Candlemas, but the first green things began to poke through. Wild garlic, bitter herbs, things that didn't taste good but tasted fresh. And that was everything. Children stumbled outside, blinking in the sunlight like hungover goblins. Elders sat by openly, doors, letting warmth touch their bones again. You could hear it in the village, laughter returning, not much, just a snort, a chuckle. Someone cursing cheerfully instead of desperately. Tools came out, hammers, ropes, spades, because when winter ended, there was work. The kind that didn't involve rationing firewood or arguing over the warmest rock. Real outdoor work, fixing fences, mending roofs, planting hope into thawed dirt. And even though you were tired in a way that crawled into your marrow, and slept there, you did it. Because spring wasn't a reward, it was a second chance. A chance to build again, to grow again, to remember who you were before the snow tried to erase you. The house, once full of smoke and coughing and curses, opened its doors. The barn, once a shelter of desperation, filled with bleating and life. The animals stretched, the trees creaked, and the world tilted ever so slightly toward color again. But something changed in you too, a quiet thing, hard to name. Surviving. A medieval winter didn't make you stronger. That's too clean, too modern. It made you harder, quieter. It taught you things, how to feel the cold in your teeth, how to hold fire like it was breath, how to recognize the sound of a family member giving up, and how to pull them back with nothing but soup and stubbornness. Tea taught you that warmth is sacred, that food is magic, that people, as unbearable as they might be in a one-room house with a snoring goat, are the only reason you're still standing. So you stood, not proud, not triumphant, but ready, because the sun was back. And next winter, you'd be ready for that too. Thanks for sticking with me through the longest, coldest, and itchiest video on the channel. If you made it all the way here, you're a survivor. 2. Drop a comment and tell me what time you're watching this. I want to know who else wandered into this blizzard with me. And hey, if you haven't yet, subscribe and share this with someone who thinks a broken heater in February is the worst thing ever. Let them meet real cold. I'll see you next time, hopefully somewhere a lot warmer.